Welcome one and all to the Spirit Side Podcast. I'm Paul James Caiden, otherwise known as Harmless Paul. I've always wanted to introduce myself that way. Hi, Harmless Paul coming to you again. There's a guy I watch on YouTube. If you're into old music, Journey, Van Halen, some of the old rock bands, he covers new music too. There's a gentleman by the name of Dave Spuria on YouTube, and his channel is called The Real Music Observer. And I'm not being paid to promote his channel. I just wanted to throw it out there if anybody's interested, because I always like the way when he introduces himself. He says, "Hi, I'm Harmless Dave," and I love it. I want to steal that so bad, unless I can come up with another fitting name for myself. Maybe I'm Paul James Caiden, the docile dude. I don't know. Shoot me an email, leave comments, let me know what's a good word I can use, so I too can be harmless. But anyway, folks, today we're going to delve into another harmless topic here on the Spirit Side. I think today, when I did the podcast on Monday about the 70 nation sacrifice on the Mount of Olives in Israel, there was some interesting feedback across the social media platforms on Facebook, a couple emails, some comments on YouTube, and you get a lot of really interesting responses to something like that, or when you talk about religion or spirituality in any way. And just for me, and I'm not putting anyone's spirituality or religion down, by no means. I'm the kind of person who says, you know what, if it works for you, if it brings you peace, if you feel closer to the divine, if it makes you a better person, you treat others well, then it works for you, by all means, stick with that, because those are the things that spirituality and religion are supposed to do. But I find sometimes I think some folks, when I talk to them or I get their emails or their comments, it seems a little overly complicated to me. And I know there's a lot of different schools of thought out there with a lot of very different and some strange ideas. And, I've mentioned it before that particularly here in the U.S., with a lot of people coming out of organized religion, they're searching, they're looking, they're trying to pick up the pieces of an organization that or institution that essentially failed them. So they're looking to cobble together whatever truth that they find or sounds reasonable to them. But I think there's a lot of schools of thought out there that people are taking ideas and fruit from that tree that it just gets really thick and overcomplicated in the area of religion. As an example, and man, I probably cannot even articulate this well enough with all the different intricacies involved in some of this. When I did the podcast on the sacrifice, for 70 nations, a lot of people came out and they follow the Gnostic idea that Jehovah, Yahweh of the Old Testament, is not the true God. He is a fallen God, a false God. And he's essentially, to some, they say he's the, basically he's Lucifer, or the devil of the New Testament. He set himself up to be God, but he's not God. And this is why he desired these animal sacrifices and burnt offerings back in the day. He was a very materialistic, kind of bloodthirsty, false God, not the true God. There's all kinds of ideas, that the whole of Israel is under this curse of the serpent, and they're going to fulfill their cursed destiny by bringing back animal sacrifices, and very few will be saved in the end when Christ returns, and many of them will go down into the pit of fire with their false serpentine God, Jehovah or Yahweh. There's all kinds of really really complex ideas that the people will write, these huge emails and comments explaining all this stuff, how it happened, why it happened, and, tie it into Egyptian mythology and Gnosticism and Satanism and, all kind of different things where it just, it'll spin your head. For me, it's like, how do some folks keep up with all this? It gets really complicated, and also a little dark. It's a little dark. For me, honestly, I read the Nag Hammadi, which a lot of these ideas come from the Gnostic view that Yahweh or Jehovah was not the true God. He was this other being created by Sophia, the female aspect of God, and it became this like abomination, serpentine being with this lion's head and glowing fierce eyes, and she hid it in the cosmos away from her other half, the male half, because she created him without him. So he was, I guess, an unbalanced entity. And he actually created the earth and man, and the true God's trying to get us out of all this mess. And to me, it played out a little too much like Greek mythology, and then that's just my opinion. Some people, may read the Nag Hammadi and get, very wonderful stuff out of it. As I always say, to each their own. But for me, it played a little bit too much like the Greek mythology with, the bumbling gods, or gods who were imperfect, and they ended up creating these demigods or bad gods, or mating with earthly men and women, and creating these half gods, and some were good and some were bad. And there was a lot of mishaps amongst the ancient gods in mythology. And for me, I don't see God that way. There is a thing in theology and philosophy that if you take a being like God, the supreme, capital G, God, and you think of this being who is perfection, perfect love, perfect wisdom, omniscient, omnipotent, all-powerful, creator of all things, always good, always loving, is not just good and loving, but is the embodiment of love, of goodness, of wisdom. It is spirit. And if you were to take away in theology, if you were to take away one of those components, then God would no longer be God. He would be God with a small g, because this would mean that he is fallible, and that there would have to be something above or beyond that being that would actually be the God, capital G. So when you come down to, male, female components of God, and one creates, this serpentine lion-headed thing that becomes Yahweh and is the false God, is the devil, and, again, to me, that takes away a certain amount of, a whole lot of wisdom, insight, love, knowledge. It detracts from the divine personage. So that couldn't possibly be God or the story of God, that his female counterpart made this, abomination and hid it away in the cosmos, and it caused all this havoc. Again, that's just, as I always say, that's making God or the gods more like men. We're envious. We make mistakes. Well, I'm going to try to do this without my partner to balance out my power, and oops, I fouled up. Now I got to hide this thing, and it's going to cause, havoc all across the cosmos. That just wouldn't, such a being or beings wouldn't be God, capital G, because it would lack so many of the divine attributes in just that one action. It would literally be the same if you think about God creating this archangel Lucifer, who eventually rebelled and fell. That would take, if you really think about it, re-examining the concept of Satan, devil, deceiver. If God created this archangel, if God, two things have to happen here, and I don't think people really think this out. Two things would have to happen in order for there to be an actual Satan or a devil. And that is, God, knowing all things, knew that if he created this Lucifer, he would rebel, he would fall, he would cause all kind of havoc, in the universe and upon the earth. But he went ahead and did it anyway. All he had to do was make that decision not to create that certain being or the beings that would follow him. And it would have saved everybody a whole lot of heartache. All right. So it would either mean God knew this would happen and he did it anyway. And this contradicts the scriptures that say in him there is no darkness or shadow of turning. There is no evil. God will not tempt us. There is no darkness. There is no thought of evil in God. So if God created an archangel that would eventually become evil and become the devil or Satan, that would mean God had the idea of evil in order to create that archangel that would become evil. Now, I hope you followed that. So, God would have to know exactly what he was doing and created what would become evil, even though the Bible and the scriptures say there's no evil or darkness in him. So he contradicted himself, or the writers of the scriptures lied and there is evil in God, which I do not believe. Or number two, God does not know all things, so he created the archangel Lucifer, and he was completely blindsided by this being who rebelled and took a number of the other angels with him. In which case, God would not be knowing of all things. He would lack that quality. He would not be God, capital G. He would be God, small g, because he would be lacking a divine attribute. Now, I know some people may get their bristles up at that thought. Oh no, there's a devil. Well, whether there is or whether there isn't, there are various and other theories on what that could be. But did God create evil? As in the Gnostics creating Yaldabaoth, the serpent-bodied with the lion head and the fiery eyes, which became Yahweh, the devil, the deceiver, trapped us all in this matrix on this earth. Or he created Lucifer, who rebelled, who fell, who took, God either created evil or was completely blindsided by it. Again, either way, it takes away a very important, actually 2 or 3 very important divine attributes. And such a being could not be God, capital G. But let's suppose, as some have said over the centuries, that when we're talking about that fall of man, we created the evil in our world, in ourselves, in our consciousness, the deceiver. And that was a choice we made. Because if you think about the story of Adam and Eve, the early Hebrews and the early Christians looked at it as being an allegory. It was not a literal historical story. I just talked to somebody on Facebook the other day who said, the Bible's not a history book, what a bunch of junk, Adam and Eve, existed 6,000 years ago. Then who built the Great Sphinx in Egypt, which is, over 2,000 years old? And I said, well, there's an error there, because that's basically a fundamentalist Christian idea that the earth is 6,000 years old, and Adam and Eve existed 6,000 years ago, literal people. That wouldn't have floated in the early days of Christianity or Judaism, because they believed the story of Adam and Eve to be an allegory, showing us, not in its totality, but at least a snapshot of what happened. God created the heavens and the earth. He created man. He created woman. He put them on the earth. And somehow man and woman made a decision to do something. Take a certain path, open themselves to certain knowledge that would affect them spiritually and make them fall, X amount of rungs down the ladder, from the perfection that God created them in. That's all the story's talking about. It was never meant to be taken literal. And I think this is where many of us stumble and get into these very peculiar theories, because we look and say literal Adam, literal Eve, literal serpent, literal tree. This is what happened. But this is a mistake, because up until fairly recent times, it was never taken literally. You hear all these churches and people say the early church believed, the early church believed. And half of it is not true. If we're taking our cues from the very early church, then we have to take the cue that the Genesis account of Adam and Eve is an allegory. Literalism always gets us into a ditch. If you look at the Hebrews, the Israelites, the sacrifice they made on the Mount of Olives just a week ago, the things they're wanting to do with their religion, and some people are looking at it, shaking their heads, going, "This is no good." this is going to lead somewhere bad. Why are these people doing this? Because they are taking their holy writings literally. Literal. You look at so many problems that, the Muslim religion has, unfortunately, with these terrorists and people that do such horrible things. Now, there's a lot of them that are not that way. But those who do, what's the big key? They take everything in the Quran literal. They don't look for the spiritual or allegorical meaning, even though the Quran itself says it is a book filled with allegories for those who know, those who have wisdom. So literalism always gets us into a ditch. What makes anybody who's a Christian think, well, the Jews do it, and man, they're making a mess. Well, some of the Muslims do it, man, they're making a mess. So I'm going to do it too and start taking my book literally. And that's caused quite a mess, and quite a mess in some of the theology as well. I would put it forth this way, because for me, and this is what works for me. This is what I have found to be reasonable, provable, and makes a lot more sense. Let me just give you a little bit of a metaphysical background on all of this. In Christian metaphysics, we say the Bible is the inspired Word of God. There are many universal truths in the Bible. It is essential to read it. But we also understand that over time, with all the different translations and religions that have, that the ideas of man have crept into the text, even as far back as those who originally transcribed it may have mixed universal truth with their very primitive idea of God. And so when you read, you have to be discerning. And I think this is why so many of us can read the Old Testament and go, man, that's good. Man, that makes sense. And then some of it we go, wow, where did that come from? That doesn't sound like God at all. Because we're being discerning. We can see the universal truth from the human error. And I just find that a very sensible way to look at any document. To look at the Bible, to look at the Quran, to look at any of it. If we have false concepts of God from the Bible, or even written in the Bible with animal sacrifices and all this kind of thing, it's not necessarily a devil making them do it or posing as God, but that devil, that deceiver, that Satan is within our own consciousness. It is our lower consciousness, or what the Bible would call our carnal mind, or what metaphysics would call our mortal mind. Mortal mind, carnal mind only sees things from the material, worldly aspect. Everything has to line up with what we see here on earth in the material world. Material world is almost more powerful than the spirit world. We say we believe in God, but oh my gosh, the problems of this material world I'll never overcome. So carnal mind, mortal mind, can receive a divine truth, but then also right next to that divine truth say, oh yes, but in order to obtain that divine truth, we have to sacrifice this animal to our very angry God. So that Satan, that deceiver, comes from within us, our lower nature, our lower mind, our lower consciousness, invents these things. And right on the other hand, in metaphysics, we say God, capital G, is all those good things. He does not love, he is love. He's not good. He is goodness personified. He is peaceful. He is healing. He is all things positive. And I've shared some quotes from Mary Aker Betty on one of my podcasts last week. And one of the things that she says that I really like is that when you look at the material world, anything that you see that is innocent, pure, beautiful, and harmonious is an expression of God. All things are an expression of God. Though matter is an illusion, because it's just waves and particles and energy, there's really no such thing as a solid. And it always gives me goosebumps because metaphysicians have said this years ago, that what we see in the physical universe has to do with how we perceive it, how we observe it. And now back in the 1800s, this was said. And now here, in the 2000s, we have quantum mechanics and quantum physicists saying this exact same thing as they look deeper and deeper into what is reality, what is these particles and waves that make up everything that we see. And these things are particles and waves because they are God's expressions, God's ideas. And essentially, we are not physical beings. We are spiritual beings. We are individual expressions of God or divine mind. And how we escape the trappings of the material world, or the matrix, as some people call it, is to rise in consciousness. Realize that God is all good. God is all love. All things are an expression of God. There is no darkness in God. God didn't create sickness and disease and devils and all this terrible stuff. That came out of the lower mind of men. Perhaps from the tree of good and evil that man partook of at one point in his history. But now, as Jesus had shown us, he always healed sickness and disease. Wherever there was ever any material obstacle or problem that someone had, he overcame it or he healed it. And even when he died, he rose again and ascended into the heavens, because Jesus embodied the Christ and showed us, I did it, you can do it too. Realize who you are. Realize you are a divine expression, an idea of God. Rise in consciousness beyond and above all of this. And as we rise in consciousness, our problems will fall away. Our bodies will be healed. Wonderful things will start to happen. And then this whole matrix begins to lose its grip on us. And that's how we escape all of this, or inevitably get away from all of this. So for me, again, that's what works. That's what makes sense. It's something that I've stumbled upon years and years ago. I've studied it. I've experimented with it. I've had other people experiment with it, and it's always shown results, good results, sometimes what we would call miraculous results. And so for me, it's just not so complicated with all of these very heavy and dark and intricate, curses and demons and gods and demigods and bumbling gods and small g gods. All of that just falls away where you start to realize it's actually very cut and dry. There is God, who is all things good. There is no darkness, no shadow of turning, no evil in God. God is divine mind, divine spirit, and all of creation, all of the universe, all of the dimensions are all expressions of God or God's ideas. and they are good. And when we experience things like evil and sickness and disease and all these problems, it's not coming from God. He did not make these things, or else again, he would not be God. They come from us, our perception, our consciousness, our wrong perception, or as metaphysics would call it, our own error. We see things wrongly. Think again of quantum mechanics. You're looking at the particle. You're observing the particles in the waves, and they're taking a certain form and likeness. And this is where we get all of the problems, all of the evil and illness and all this type of thing, because we're observing the particles and seeing that. We expect that to happen in our world, in our life. I hope you got a hold of that. It's our thoughts and our observations of the world around us that make it so. God is saying, no, I have not given you the spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. Renew your mind. Verses like that really kind of spring off the page and make a lot more sense when you think of it from that metaphysical point of view. As a man thinks, so he is. You have the mind of Christ. It all starts and it all ends within ourselves. Wrong or right perception. God is always good. We don't ever have to be afraid of God or worry that he created some, serpentine, lion-headed creature that's leading everybody astray or wanting other people to kill animals. We don't ever have to worry that he created some archangel knowingly or unknowingly that rebelled and brought the whole universe into chaos. But our deep belief in those things, our observation, the way we see the world and the universe around us, can certainly cause chaos. And that's the whole book of Revelation is, from a metaphysical point of view, as we focus so much on the material world, following our base thoughts in nature, observing wrongly, that a lot of things are going to be shaken up and things are going to get really bad. And some people are going to make some really horrible decisions before it gets better, before the Christ returns and restores harmony to the earth, to the universe, to all things. But that Christ will come when we are ready to receive it and raise our consciousness up to meet it. You hear a lot of people talk about Christ consciousness. Well, they're not so far off the mark with that particular word or definition of the Christ. And I don't know about any of you out there, but when I think of these things that, all the mess that we have, it's all coming from our own consciousness, our mortal mind, our carnal thoughts. But as Jesus said, take heart, I have overcome the world. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Who is in us? Christ. What is Christ in metaphysics? The law, the power of God that Jesus embodied. He showed us that we can. He showed us how. So it just makes life a lot more, I think, peaceful to know that all the nonsense that we encounter, again, comes from our mortal mind, our carnal thinking. But out there is God. Everything is an expression of God, and God is always good. He is love. He just doesn't love. He is love personified, and he's always on our side. He's never trying to teach us lessons by giving us cancer and making us sick or making us lose our job or putting us through all these horrible tests and trials to grow our faith. No, that's not God. That would be darkness and evil in God, perceiving and conceiving of those things to put them on his creation. And that is an impossibility in metaphysics and actually in theology. Again, when you take a certain attribute, divine attribute, away from God, he is no longer God. So God can't possibly do or be these things that cause trouble and darkness and problems. And that's I think that's a very restful thought to have. God is good all the time. God is love all the time. God loves us all the time. He's for us. He wants to raise us up, not beat us down, not make things complicated with, devils and, Yaldabaoths and, all this crazy stuff and false god Yahwehs and all that type of thing. No, that all comes from our own lower consciousness. And we can just start to erase it away. If other people want to hold on to it longer than others, that's their business. We don't have to. We can start to rise in consciousness, Christ consciousness, being one with all that is good, and then our experience will start to be good and harmonious and loving and peaceful. This stuff works, folks. And again, I'm not pushing my ideology on anybody. I'm just telling you what my many years of study have found to be. And I just always felt in my heart of hearts all this overcomplicated stuff that we hear here, there, and everywhere just never made a lot of sense to me. And I've always looked at it and said, that just doesn't line up to be God. It's too confusing, too convoluted. It makes man having to be some kind of, mastermind, spiritual genius to figure it all out, to even have any hope of, breaking away from the matrix and the lower life. It gets really crazy. And I just don't think God threw us in one great big jigsaw puzzle and said, all right, there you go, figure it all out. That just never made sense to me. So anyway, folks, again, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I appreciate you tuning in and listening to my thoughts. And again, if you feel that you want to support the podcast, visit me on Patreon. The link to my Patreon page is below. Also, my Angel Thoughts page, if you want to get an angel reading, spiritual counseling, just someone to talk to and get a spiritual, metaphysical perspective on things that are going on in your life. Head on over to the Angel Thoughts page and drop me a line. The link to that is below also. Or you can support the podcast right here on Anchor. So I appreciate you all listening. I always enjoy having these talks. I love podcasting, and it's a source of joy in my life, and I know many of you enjoy it too, which makes it even more exciting to me because these topics kind of drop into my mind. I spit them into the mic, and other people get something out of it. That's awesome. So thank you for listening. I'll see you all next time here on the Spirit Side. Until then, be good, be safe out there, everybody. Peace.